So I'm happy to welcome Melissa Miles, an environmental justice organizer and advocate of the Ironbound Corporation, to give us our keynote for the symposium. Miles works tirelessly in Newark to protect communities affected by environmental injustice, but also to aid communities in holding stakeholders accountable for their toxicities, adding to the cumulative disadvantage of certain communities. We thank her for joining us and taking the time out to come down from Newark. Let's welcome Ms. Miles.
Am I on? Hey, good morning, everybody. So I'm Melissa. Glad to see you all. If your back is to me, maybe you want to turn around. I know this table was so lit in the break. I wanted to come over and join you, but I thought, let me not. Yeah, I'm so glad to be here with you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for inviting me. I see a lot of fresh faces, so I know a lot of you missed the panel earlier. It was so great. I'm actually glad you missed it because they said everything I was going to say, so you wouldn't have been hearing anything new. Because actually, the work that the panelists talked about, is very much overlaps with the work that I do in Newark. Normally, I like to start by just acknowledging the land that we're on, and earlier, Pastor Norwood, who's still here, and so if you want to chat with him after, he, was able to tell us a little bit about the first people on this land, the Lenni Lenape, and this is Newark. It was and still is Lenni Lenape land. So Newark is along the bank of the Passaic River. There was a time when that was the pristine river, when you could fish, when you could, eat the crab. Not so much anymore. Now it's the nation's longest Superfund site, which just means it's so polluted that it will be about 3 generations before anyone can even imagine, being safe in that river. And that is a result of capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, let's just name it. It's racism. So I think, one of the number one things that we're hopefully going to do is, by the time you walk out of here, you will see your way to interject into this system of inequity that perpetuates, from then until now. But to begin, I just want to take a moment of silence for Nipsey Hussle. This is real. Thank you. So why start with Nipsey Hussle? Why not? I mean, on the East Coast, we haven't had so many memorials and tributes, but, folks have been very impacted by, the senseless killing of this young man. And, believe it or not, it is linked to environmental justice. How? Because again, there is a system that is at work all the time, everywhere, that makes it so that life is just harder for people of color in this country. It's just harder for people who don't have resource in this country. It's real. I mean, we can talk about it in the most abstract ways, but when it comes down to it, we live in a country, in a system that was built on slavery, that was built on the death and destruction of the people who were here first. Where do you go from that? Until we address it with open eyes, with clarity, with compassion, it's gonna continue. Cycles of violence, both the immediate violence of guns and drugs in urban communities and the slow violence of environmental racism that claims way more lives, actually, than the sensationalized violence that we may see on TV. So, and another reason why I wanted to start is because, I feel like Nipsey Hussle is an example of a person who found a way, to make a difference in one community. And that's really all anybody has to do, right? We don't have to save the world. We actually just have to start where we live. When we stand up where we are, we have the capacity to make an enormous difference. And how I learned that is through my mentor, a man, Daisaku Ikeda now. He's 92, living his best life still. He's still doing that at 92. never actually even graduated college, but has over 300 honorary degrees from universities around the world, and is like, one of the people who has had the most to do with securing peace throughout the world for about the last 50 years. You probably never heard of him, but, he's been behind the scenes. And, through him, I learned that a great human revolution in just a single individual will help achieve a change in the destiny of a nation, and further, can even enable a change in the destiny of all humankind. Now, what does that mean? It starts with the individual and our own desire, to insert ourselves into systems of inequity and to make a change, right? And so when we ourselves conceive of that desire, we change. And then others seeing our change can be impacted by that change. And so in that way, people change, households change, communities change, and one by one, dialogue by dialogue, nations change, the world changes. So I am a firm believer that, the problem, some of you were here earlier, I mean, it's pretty bleak. If you think about everything from, I know a lot of you are studying with Dr. Jackson. You have learned about the problems, the environmental problems that many communities throughout New Jersey, throughout the country are facing. Pretty much all of you know about climate change, what's happening throughout the world. It looks pretty dire. But because of this, I am 100% confident that we can change this trajectory. But it really starts with each individual. So, let's see, okay. All right, so that's me. This is this slide kind of speaks to how I started in this work. So these are my two children. They're now older, but they're still doing the same. The youngest is still telling people what to do. The oldest is still screaming. He's 7 and he's 4. This was sort of my entree into, both organizing, advocacy, speaking. Now, I have spent almost my entire life trying not to be an advocate for anything. Why? Because I wanted to stay out of jail, right? Like all those systems I talked about, the paycheck, I wanted to be good. I didn't want to go to jail. So if you would have asked me 3 or 4 years ago, would I now be for a living challenging systems of inequality, I'd say you were crazy. But it just so happened that I got kind of chosen into this work in a sense, because what happened is living in the Ironbound, and I'll talk more about the Ironbound as a community, my oldest son at 1 year old was diagnosed with asthma. So up until then, I wasn't really aware of what was happening around me. I wasn't aware that we had the region's largest incinerator. I wasn't aware that we were a port community. I wasn't aware that there were hundreds of trucks, diesel burning trucks passing through the community. I wasn't aware that we had 2 power plants within the 5-mile region of the Ironbound. But I did know organizers who had got me out, to talk at hearings about the river, to talk about my experience. So I was organized, basically. And then when my son was diagnosed with asthma, the first place I went was to Ironbound Community Corporation. And I went there crying because I never imagined that I would have to take my 1-year-old to the emergency room because he couldn't breathe. And so that was my entry point into environmental justice because it happened to me. Actually, just recently, my 4-year-old was prescribed the asthma medication as well. So now, they both have to be on the nebulizer at times. So anyhow, this was how it all began. I'm standing here not as an expert, not as a scientist. I'm standing here as the person whose lived experience is of environmental injustice and environmental racism. I grew up in the Bronx, which is a place not much unlike, it's very similar to Newark. And then also, honestly, there was a time when I tried to leave Newark, right after they were diagnosed, because I figured, if this community is so horrible, why am I gonna stay here? And I left and we moved. We actually moved to Brazil where my kid's dad is from. And guess what? It wasn't any better. Because as a Black woman, a working class woman, chances are I'm gonna live near pollution. Statistically speaking, I could be rich and still I am more likely to live in a toxic environment than a poor person who is not a person of color. So at that point, I decided that I needed to stand up where I was, because I needed to, why leave a place where there are other children suffering and other people suffering to go somewhere else when really I have to change where I am. And it started, basically with me. Welcome to the Ironbound. How many of you have been to Newark? Raise your hand if you've been to, okay, so now let's change. If you've been to Newark, not through Newark, because I know we have Penn Station and Newark Airport. If you've been to Newark, like stepped on the ground and walked around, raise your hand. Okay, cool. How many of you would say you're from like an urban place, in Newark, Camden, Philly? No, okay. Okay, cool. So, a lot of Newark is not unlike many urban cities. So the Ironbound's kind of like an enclave in Newark. When you hear about Newark, I'm not gonna make this so interactive. Normally I take response, but, we know what you hear. You hear about violence, you hear about lead in the water. You rarely hear good things about a place like Newark. If you're a little older, what you may remember is the rebellion back in the 60s. Some of you may have remember that, and what that was called a riot, but we call it a rebellion because it started from police brutality. And so Newark basically is a city that, from the time of Robert Treat, when, the invaders, as Pastor Norwood called them, came, to New Jersey. And, from then, there's been industry growing there. It was basically like a white city. Once all of the indigenous people were exterminated or died from disease or forced north or forced out of the area, it was a very white city. And it was divided between, the white people who lived up on the hill and had money, and then the more recent immigrants from places like Germany, Poland, more recently Portugal, Spain. So the Ironbound was the place where the immigrants were settled. And so that was the original divide in Newark. It was like the American white people and then the Europeans. And so that was the place where all the industry was. It was closer to the river. Those folks sometimes worked those jobs. So that was the original sacrifice zone, the throwaway zone. Those were the undesirable people. Then, due to, the Great Migration, the rebellion, there was white flight from Newark. Too many black people came and the white people left, right? And they moved out to the suburbs and took, the jobs and sort of the economic base of Newark with them. And so, but the Ironbound remained sort of that same enclave of European immigrants. So for many, many years, while the rest of the city was largely black, that part of the city still remained, European immigrants and their descendants. Now the city of Newark is about, the black population, Latino population is about equal. But in the Ironbound, it's still kind of skewed because you still have lots of Portuguese folks, some remnants of Italians. And so Ironbound is really known for like Iberian food and things like that, but it's still part of Newark. And it's, one of the most, our zip code 07105, I didn't learn until I was traveling the country, meeting other communities like ours, is famous for the amount of industrial pollution that we deal with. So this is Ferry Street, one of the main corridors. So yeah, Newark Penn Station. So we're bounded by transportation. There's 1 and 9, there's 95, there's 78, there's Penn Station, there's the airport, right? So we are surrounded by highways, by railways. And it kind of like, it's a place that people pass through, but up until recently didn't really land until we got like the Prudential Center, and now there are places where NJ Pack where people go and actually recreate. Okay, so the Ironbound itself is really, part of the reason why it is because it's actually zoned, zoned for industry, right? So if you go to suburbs, you can't build an incinerator in a suburb. You can't. It's not zoned for that. But the Ironbound is zoned for industry. So here we have examples of how, laws, both municipal law, in this case, municipal law, functions to, allow people to be nestled in with dirty industries. They're really, you can't see from these pictures, but this is not so far from where people live. So what this is a paper recycling plant. People think recycling is like a clean business. It's not. And then that's a picture of port containers because we are a port adjacent community. And, there are places in the community where there are just containers stacked up because there was a time when, containers came in to the country with goods and then they went back out with goods. But we don't manufacture so much anymore, so those containers sit. By the way, does anyone know what we do ship out? What is our #1 export? Trash. Okay, so yeah, so we got the paper. In addition to the paper, in the Ironbound alone, in Newark, there are about 35 waste-related facilities. So basically what that means is trash comes on trucks and barges from other places and comes to us so that it can be sorted or it can wait and sit for more trucks to come pick it up and take it somewhere else. If it's lucky, then it gets to go to our incinerator. So in addition to, the actual injustice of having to deal with other people's garbage, we have these diesel burning trucks that come through our neighborhood to pick it up and drop it off and that kind of stuff. This actually is a plastic factory, and there's houses everywhere. This thing makes plastic. I lived across the street from this when my son got asthma, and this is grandfathered in, right? So this ain't going nowhere anytime soon, And does this look like a new facility? Does it look state of the art? No. Basically pumps fumes out through tubes in the top and brings trucks in. But anyway, that's my life. These are more waste-related trucks. And it's the Ironbound is literally one of the densest places in New Jersey, the most people in the smallest amount of space. And so it's not that this is happening over there somewhere. There are homes nestled in between all of these dirty industries. This is metal recycling. This is there are houses across the street. Imagine waking up and you're hearing metal crunching and trucks across the street and, things backing up. This is reality for people. And it's not that, do they have any less of a right to sort of live a healthy, sane life? I don't think so. This is Sims Metal Management. It's one of the largest metal companies in the world. They have branches everywhere. So what I found out while I was in Texas doing an environmental justice tour there, by the way, we do environmental justice tours. Anyone's ever interested in coming down to Newark and doing a tour, we will take you around the community and actually show you the things that I'm just talking about now. So what I found out is that when metal is crushed, it actually releases particles into the air that also get into the lungs. Sorry. This is less than 2 blocks away from a school. And in the back is Newark Bay Cogen. That's a power plant. That's right. Okay, so we have all this messed up stuff. And that, I just really touched the tip of the iceberg. There are about 300, we have brownfields out the wazoo. We have streets where the industry, it was so bad. We have this one street called Manufacturer's Place, you can look it up, where there should have never been houses there. It's the site of the old Ronson, Ronson lighter fluid. So they made lighters. And when that company left, they did a really bad cleanup. And they capped it, right? So they kind of get out the top layers of soil, and then they cap it. But the whole area was deed restricted. No house should ever have been built on that land. But somehow through some kind of some language loophole, They were able to get approval from Newark City Hall. This is about 10 years back. They built homes on that land. They sold them to new families, basically like first and second generation immigrant families just looking for a piece of the American dream. Sold them those deed restricted homes with the clause in fine print. And it wasn't until people's pets started dying, both pets dying, one child was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer, people started getting headaches and all kinds of like weird symptoms. And then at the same time, the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, just happening to do some sort of survey of the area, realized that there were homes there. There were never supposed to be homes there. And so there's a whole street where people live that has vapor intrusion from trichloroethylene. And so what the DEP did after organizing, right, after people got together, and organized and demanded something happen, the DEP put pumps, sub-slab pumps in their basement that basically pumps the gas from the soil out, into the air above their roofs. And that's the solution. So right now there's actually the Attorney General and the DEP have this huge court case where they're trying to recuperate the damages, right, like the natural resource damages for their own expense, not for the people who are living there or the people who have homes they can never sell. So, this is just a little piece of the burden that we bear so that, other people can make money or not think about where their trash goes or flush the toilet, honestly, and not think about where that goes, because we also have the region's largest waste treatment plant. So that these are called externalities, right? So that people can have, you can have your iPods, you can have your clothes. We live near a port where trucks and ships come in burning diesel fuel, which is so toxic. It's so toxic, it has like this substance PM 2.5 that's so small that you can inhale it and it can go directly into your bloodstream, right? So that, people can live a modern life and not think about these things, some communities suffer and pay, the price in their health and their well-being. But we're not victims, right? So someone said earlier, from the communities that are most impacted also have solutions, right? We live it, and so we're the experts, and so that's one thing that I really want to, drive home. I didn't go to school for any of this, right? Like, I learned this on the job, in my day-to-day reality of living in this community is how I learned this, is how I came to be standing here before you, not because I have a degree in this. As a matter of fact, I don't need to have a degree in anything to do this work, at all. That's what I learned, that, that paper does not give me expert status when it comes to environmental justice. And to be an ally, you need to realize that, and when you go into communities, your own communities or other communities, which hopefully you will in some capacity, to be an ally, please understand that it's not to take the lead. It's actually to follow the direction of those that are on the ground in the front lines. So, we have our own solutions, and our solution to all this, the number one is community building, base building, and organizing people for change. But we don't do it alone. So I kind of started with People's Climate March. We were very heavily involved in both People's Climate Marches. So climate, environment, a little different, but both related, right? So we deal with a lot of environmental pollution, but the fact that we are such a vulnerable community also makes us very vulnerable to climate change. At the same time, we understand that we are allies to First Nations people, to indigenous people who have always been on the front lines of the climate justice movement, because, so we also, take our lead from other communities that are more rooted in this struggle. So, we're allies to other communities. And so that's what the People's Climate March was for us, and we always have young people with us because, they live in the community, they always have, and they probably will continue to. So they're the ones who are going to pick up the mantle of organizing. So we also work with lots of coalitions. We're a small community. Ironbound Community Corporation is a tiny organization. I myself am one person who works on like such a wide range of issues. I loved seeing the panelists because, I learned so much from others who, have issues that they can really go broad and deep in. We have so much that we have to deal with. It's hard to go broad and deep. So we look to coalitions to actually help lend us capacity. So we also do things within our community. So Newark has some of the lowest tree canopy, amount of tree canopy in New Jersey because there's so much concrete, because there's so much industry. So we actively plant trees. We're always planting trees. We also have our own community farm and garden. We have about 2 gardens and 1 farm. Our farm is built on also capped land. So almost all of, it's hard to find land in the Ironbound that isn't contaminated with something. So everything has to be on raised beds. Our work is intersectional. It's not just about environment. We also, it's because it's systemic injustice that, is related to gender expression, race, color, nationality, language. We try to be allies to different people in different struggles. So we also do work around police accountability. You probably don't know about this, but Newark has, we have like pieces of legislation that we helped get passed around police accountability and civilian review of the police. Right now it's in court, but if it's able to, if it passes through this process, it'll be the strongest civilian complaint review board in the country. The people will actually have subpoena power over the police. And this came about because our police force is under federal review. What does that, what does the police and police injustice and police brutality have to do with the environment? Well, it all happens together. We can't be single issue people because the people that we serve are not single issue, right? How can you talk to people about air pollution if they can't go outside because they're flooded in, or because, they're dealing with, drugs in the hallway, or because they're being displaced because gentrification is happening in our community, even as we have all these issues. So we can't be single issue. Yes, we do a lot of gardening in the summer with our young people, which is also just a way to keep young people involved and engaged. We have Down Bottom Farms, which you're all welcome to come visit. We also have our Instagram, Down Bottom Farms. So check us out on IG. We also connect with other businesses, sustainable businesses, and invite them into our space so that, we can benefit from each other's presence. This is Jersey Buzz. They are beekeepers, Newark beekeepers. We do grow food. So the food program is mainly for like the young people that plant and harvest. This is another way that college students become involved with us over the summer mainly, is by coming out to the farm and in being part of that program, helping to mentor, and also learning from our youth who have been doing this work on the front line, some of them since they were like 5 and 6 years old. Okay, so these are some of the other things we do. Sometimes we sell produce, depending on how much we have. This market over here, so we also incubate co-ops, because so much of the population of the Ironbound particularly is undocumented. We also have to, take into account that in order to organize people, we have to address first what are the basic needs. So when you have undocumented folks, who are more vulnerable to the system and, to injustices in the workplace, we want everyone to be able to, really have work that is just and sustainable. So we have a green workers cooperative, which basically, they get contracts to do cleaning services with products that they themselves make that are non-toxic. And then they also have, they do a bazaar. We also raise chickens. We try to cook and eat together in community. You know, all of this is actually, it may seem unrelated, but the more people spend time together, the more they talk, the more they produce, you know, in their own community, the more they learn to relate and share. You know, we ourselves want to be a model for what other communities can be. The more we produce, the less waste we make, right? So we don't want other people's waste, but we also want to produce less waste ourselves. So we make these things fun. So this, unrelated, related but unrelated. So I told Christina I was going to talk a little bit about policy. Normally, I don't talk about policy. I really stick to organizing and base building because that's what we do. But because since Governor Murphy was elected into office, so many processes have started rolling at the state level. You know, so it's kind of funny because, you know, when Trump was elected, a lot of things started to happen in the environmental and climate justice community. There was like a huge outpouring. That's sort of when I started in this work. If you're ever on YouTube and you just plug in my name and J20, which is the day, January 20 was the inauguration day, you'll see some speeches by indigenous youth, myself, and other groups, you know, about how we could resist, you know, the coming regime. Right? So that really catalyzed a lot of movement in the climate and environmental justice community. This was kind of like the same sort of catalyst, but in a better way, and in New Jersey in particular. So Governor Murphy, before he was elected, you know, many climate and environmental justice advocates, you know, were already speaking with him and his wife, Dina Murphy, who is also like a champion of the environment. So he was elected already knowing many of the issues that we face. Okay, so as soon as he was elected, he sort of came in on this platform of environmental justice. Both good and bad. Why? Because environmental justice is really about people on the front lines telling their own story. But once it becomes sort of popularized as a name and as a thing, then it like becomes something else. And we always have to remember that environmental justice is really about the grassroots, the front lines, the people who are living this experience of being exposed and also are uplifting the solutions. So like I pretty much work with everyone in this picture in some capacity or another. The guy, 1, 2, 3, 4th from your, right? I don't know, don't ask. That's Joe Delafave. He's actually the ED of Ironbound Community Corporation. Right next to him is Ana Batista, who was the first director of my department and also my mentor. She's with the New School Tishman Center, who we work very closely with. Some of these folks are also on the Environmental Justice Advisory Council of the DEP. I also sit on that council. So they were all there with Governor Murphy when he signed Executive Order 23, which is like the EJ order, right? It basically says that all state departments have to think about environmental justice before they undertake any major project. The only issue is this executive order has no teeth. Right? There is no real regulation behind it, and it's still totally sort of like fluffy. So environmental justice groups actually are really pushing back on the DEP to make this something that can actually protect communities. Other recent pieces of legislation that are sort of coming or going, S-1700, which is a cumulative impacts bill. So some of these folks like Ana Batista, Dr. Nikki Sheets, who's the third from this side, have been talking about cumulative impacts for many years. What that means is that at this point, when a facility like, you know, a power plant or a waste treatment plant wants to be sited in the community, they have to apply for permits and such. These permits actually allow them to pollute, but only up to a certain level. Right? So they can pollute up to a certain threshold. Now, what it doesn't take into account is the facility across the street that's also polluting to that threshold. And what happens when you have different chemicals and pollution mixing together in the air and several facilities in the same region, which is what you see in the Ironbound. So cumulative impacts is a way to address the fact that there are multiple sources of pollution in the community. Let's stop looking at one facility at a time. Okay, so the state has been both our enemy and our ally in getting cumulative impacts to be considered. So this bill, this Senate bill, is an opportunity for us to, basically have cumulative impacts begin to be considered. Other ones, community solar. This is my favorite because it's basically a project that's going to allow communities, low-income communities mainly, to have access to solar energy. So in a place like Ironbound, where we have 2 power plants and a trash-burning incinerator that are all producing energy and also polluting the air and driving, putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, driving climate change, we also want access to cleaner forms of energy. We want access to energy efficiency, renewable energy. Things like this have been largely inaccessible to urban communities. They've only been accessible to middle class and upper class communities, people who had nice roofs and houses that they owned, okay? So as 1700, community solar. So basically there are, since Governor Murphy was elected, there's more opportunity for both environmental and environmental justice groups to have their concerns heard, to come to the table, but it's still a struggle. Like I said, the Department of Environmental Protection has been both our ally and our enemy. We have to hold them accountable. So there are so many ways that you all can be involved, whether it's through, it's law, science, advocacy, social work, health. We have partners in all of these fields who lend capacity to us. We could not do this work without allies. And so, whether you come from a community like mine or whether you come from a more affluent community, there is a place for you in this movement. It's just really going to be up to you to decide where is your point of intersection, and what you can do to be an ally to communities on the front line of environmental injustice. And I'll stop there and let you all ask some questions. I think I had some more slides. I'm going to get to this transition.
Let's give Ms. Miles another round of applause for that wonderful presentation. And I just want to say I was super appreciative of many things that you said in the presentation, but I was also really appreciating the discussion that we've been having in my Place Matters class about cumulative impacts, right? And so I didn't really, at the symposium, I didn't really take any time to talk about my research, and I won't now. But in the past, when I was doing organizing work in San Francisco, that was one of the main points. So Bayview Hunters Point is basically is Newark. Right next to us, the Superfund site, Hunters Point Shipyard. And similar story, was obviously up and running during World War II, recruited a lot of Black migrants. The place has remained super, super toxic. And so I was working with residents about organizing around that. But many times in some of the articles, and you can look some of my stuff up, but one of the things that I'm finding is that when I'm sitting in on a lot of these meetings with the Navy or other stakeholders, many of them, what I call use this kind of growth machine mentality where they're saying, well, this is just our organization, our corporation, and we're just polluting this. But what they're not taking into account is not only the other toxic facilities across the street or down the street, but they're also not taking into account the condition of other things in that particular city, like the education system and housing, quality, affordability, right? So, and this was, I think, a theme of the panel as well, right? We can't afford to be single issue on this, right? These communities are the same communities that are also prey to gentrification, right? So they're rapidly, rapidly changing. So I just wanted to thank you for bringing that up, and that's definitely been one of the themes of our classes. So we have about 20 more minutes left, and I wanted to leave plenty of room for discussion and question and answer. So I have a couple questions, but I'm going to open it up to you all since this is for you all. So does anybody have questions, comments, thoughts, even connections? Go ahead. And maybe say your name first.
Hello, my name is Erica. I just want to ask about if you had more information on the collaboration of the Attorney General and the NJDEP, what their interests are and how that relates to the people.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So their collaboration is around enforcement. Right, so for many years, So, bigger picture, I'm from New York. We didn't come to New Jersey. We called it Dirty Jersey. You get on the turnpike, there are smells, right? New Jersey is sort of known as a place where there is dirty industry, refineries, and, toxic things and weird smells, right? So a lot of these different industries have been grandfathered, which just means that they couldn't get a permit to be where they are now, but because they're there, it's hard to get them out. And so the Attorney General and the DEP are working together to look at some of these older grandfathered facilities. They're also going after large polluters like DuPont, polluters that have sort of been polluting, places with impunity for many years. And so that street that I mentioned where the Ronson Lighter Factory is, that's one of the places that the DEP and the Attorney General have combined to basically find and sue the polluter to recuperate damages. So, their main angle is enforcement and, to sort of hold accountable some of these polluters that have been getting away with it for a long time.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a follow-up question on that. So similarly, I was just a couple days ago in preparation for this, actually reading the Executive Order 23, right? So a lot of people talk about it, but the PDF is available online for people to be able to read. And I was going through it and reading it, and I was like, oh, this sounds good, this sounds good. But then I was just reading the fine print, and I'm like, there's no actual language about how to enforce it. And it even has a weird clause, and I would bring it up, but I won't now, but even has a weird clause that talks about something about it can't override private interest. And I was like, well, isn't it the private interest that may be doing some of the polluting? Not all of it. So I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more on the fact that it's good that it's bringing that awareness to the table, but it doesn't necessarily keep actual entities accountable.
So, EO 23 is something that I got to sort of see from zero to where it is now. And the first thing is the Department of Environmental Protection, the EJ office there, had I think maybe like 100 days to get that thing off the ground. They were under such a time crunch that EJ communities, we don't do anything in a rush. Why? Because when you rush, it doesn't come out right. Somebody gets left out, equity gets thrown to the side, we like to see things taken through various processes of vetting by communities and community input, and and that EO 23 just, it went through some of that process, but it was under such a huge time constraint that it probably just isn't what it would be if they had had a year to work on it or something like that. And then, like you're saying, Dr. Jackson, basically what it's calling for is for state agencies to form a coalition to think about environmental justice. This has been done before. This is not the first time the DEP has done something like this. This is something like the 4th or 5th iteration of it, and so, folks like Nikki Sheets and Ana Bautista, they've seen this for years. The DEP comes up with a plan like this, and then it goes nowhere, because there's nothing actually in it that actually holds anyone accountable or forces them to do anything, to do what it says that they should. It's like a suggestion at best. And that's problematic, because what it is really is more of the same. But we are going to have to do something different, in order to get a different result.
Thank you. Other questions, comments?
Is anyone you have a team working on the zoning issues that are allowing people to build homes in these areas where there should not be people?
So Newark actually has a cumulative impacts ordinance. We're one of the first states to have it. But enforcement is always the issue, especially in a city like Newark. Many things that may be on the books, such as truck routes, trucks shouldn't be coming by our schools. There's no mechanism for enforcement. So the cumulative impacts ordinance is we already have a law in Newark that says, you know, when a new industry wants to come in, they have to submit certain paperwork that says, you know, that shows that they've analyzed or looked at what is around them and how they are impacting the environment. However, this is reviewed by a volunteer board. They don't get paid, they have day jobs. It's a very kind of cumbersome process. It too, the actual zoning board doesn't always utilize it the way that they need to. So even though it's on the books, we haven't really seen it roll out the way it needs to yet. And so we are working actually to get that board funding so that, you know, someone can actually spend time looking at these applications that are coming in. Newark is developing rapidly, so there are many, many applications coming in. We actually go to zoning board meetings. We go to planning board meetings. That's another thing you can do. In the town where you live, or even here in this town, go to the zoning board, go to the planning board, find out what's being built and by whom and for whom. So we are present in those conversations, but, you know, honestly, getting it actually rolling out and enforced has been a whole other issue.
Yeah, and I just wanted to second what you just said as well. And actually, I think one of our poli-sci classes, I think Dr. Forrestal's classes, actually have had students go to a lot of these different type of meetings. And, you know, Dr. Burdick and I were talking about this before. You know, a lot of times students will feel like, oh, well, what am I supposed to do, you know, this type of air. And students actually hold a lot of power, right? We have a lot of privilege and we have a lot of power, right? And, you know, I really appreciated your point when you were talking about, you know, this kind of savior mentality and, you know, what we do, well-meaned, right? We come in just like, oh, we want to help, we want to solve the problem, right? But communities have been working on this way before we were probably even born, myself included. When I did my work in San Francisco, I started volunteering for an environmental justice organization called Green Action. And, you know, I feel like my relationship with them mirrored the relationship that I think that, in my opinion, universities should have with local community organizations. And so, you know, I kind of came in, I told them about the project that I was doing for my dissertation research, and they put me day one protest. You know, I didn't know, I can't remember if that was my first protest, but they were protesting the PG&E headquarters, which is Pacific Gas and Electric Company, and they were presenting during lunch, when they knew all the people that would be coming out during that time, what they called a toxic hall of shame, and it was all the toxicities that they've emitted in this Bayview Hunters Point community. And so I did stuff like that, and then I did things that they needed my help to do, right, with the skills. So all you all here have a lot of these wonderful skills, these communication skills, access to GIS mapping and all these other cool tools that we can use, data, things like that, that could really assist, not lead, but really assist organizations that are grassroots, because a lot of these organizations don't have a lot of funding and they don't have a lot of resources like we have. So we can actually invest our time, right, to help these organizations, and not just Ironbound. You know, we help a lot of organizations. You know, Amanda was talking about how we helped NJOP. Same thing. We had the relationship where NJOP was looking for data for their report, right? And so my students and I canvassed, right? And we went door to door knocking to find out the process of if people were home yet. That helped us in learning about how our communities are impacted, and also help them as an organization. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the role that, in your opinion, that students and universities can play to assist local environmental struggles, but just local community struggles.
And to that end, what has Rutgers done?
Wait, Wilda, let me get you on the mic.
For the last 10 years?
Okay, so
Can I have her repeat it?
sure. Okay.
And along those lines, what has Rutgers University done in the last 10 years? Because I know they have a very committed university that is doing a lot of work. So I'm curious, because you can actually tell us what's been the work in the community.
Okay, so I'm fairly new, but I do, the person who was in my position before me really doesn't have great things to say about Rutgers' involvement actually in the community. So there's always this tension, you know, between academia and community, right? Because, you know, academia is sort of a seat of power and privilege. You know, it's a place where knowledge tends to be confined, and so there can be this real tension between academia and community, and it really takes a lot of work to foster real relationships with the communities that, where these universities are. Universities are notorious for buying up land, for taking up space, for eating up tax base. So how do we balance that and rectify that is, I think a much bigger question. As far as Rutgers, we do work with Rutgers Center for Environmental Exposures, the Environment and Occupational Hazards. There's a doctor there, Dr. Robert Lumbach, who really lends a lot of capacity to our organization and to our different coalitions that we work on. When the vapor intrusion was discovered, he was the doctor that saw the people who lived on that street. Why? Because, as much evidence as there is that certain chemicals cause certain problems, you will never find a doctor who will say your asthma is because you breathed in black carbon. It just doesn't exist. It's difficult to find physicians who are connected in that way, to what's actually happening on the ground in communities. So, we definitely work with Rutgers EOSHI in that regard. We also work with the New School Tishman Center. They've provided a lot of capacity in the ways of data, reports. We've worked with UC Berkeley around port issues. Thomas Edison University, also with data and capacity. We work with lawyers like Earth Justice, NRDC. So, really, we, like Professor Jackson is saying, we're a very small team. There are about 8 of us who work on everything from immigration and housing justice, food justice, environmental justice, climate justice, state policy, national policy, local policy, so without those connections, we would really be sort of in the dark and at a loss. And, you also mentioned we write our own grants in my department. If I don't write a grant, I don't get paid. I don't have a job next year. So on top of all of the actual work we do, we actually have to find our own money. So that's another place where, so information, resources, data, reports, all of those kind of things are areas where, folks can lend capacity, and also just bodies, right? We have a farm, we have gardens, we do protests, communication. So there are a lot of ways, I think, that folks can be of use to organizations that are doing this kind of work. And the panelists that are here that you can meet afterwards also, I'm sure will have ways that you can become involved in their organizations.
Other questions?
So I want to follow up on Dr. Colon's question, because Rutgers Newark could be a real champion. Isn't their president still Nancy Cantor?
Yeah.
So this relates to our students and what Dr. Jackson and I were talking about before. I heard Nancy Cantor give the most incredible presentation on student engagement many years ago when she was at University of Illinois. And she said, basically, most of us think, oh, engagement is social work, anthropology, political science. But her example was a professor of organic chemistry who decided to make environmental activists out of, I think it was a male, out of his students, because they started to talk about the bioaccumulation of mercury. He made his class relevant, and he made them all activists, and it really made a difference. And the thing that students need to know is that you are listened to. Nancy Cantor was a wonderful advocate, but people in charge get caught up in all their own stuff, and they lose their way. They lose their track, and they need to be reminded about their roots, and students are the best to do that. I had a session in Washington, D.C., in the bowels of the Capitol building once, where there were all these, blue suited advocates, the 4-to-1 that one of the speakers this morning talked about, the lobbyists for the industry. But we had a bunch of students that looked just like you guys come into the room. And I can't tell you, it was palpable. It was before cell phones, or I would have videotaped it. But the members of Congress wanted nothing at all to do with the suit people and the advocates. They made eye contact and asked questions of the Stockton students in the room. And the power you guys have is just really important. And like, we should do more of what many Stockton classes are doing for environmental advocacy in AC. And we should link with groups like this up in the Ironbound district as well, because many of our students come from up there. I mean, you have so much more power than you realize.
Thank you. Yes, Nancy Cantor is definitely an ally of our organization and has been for a long time. But you know, what you were saying brings to mind, is one of the complaints we have about working with university students is when they drain us of capacity rather than add to capacity. So for example, yesterday, a student, a Rutgers student from a class that we've been working with, we work with a lot of professors at Rutgers individually, right? So they'll contact us, we'll go speak to their students, sometimes we'll teach classes. My director actually taught a whole semester, co-taught a semester with a teacher at Rutgers, a journalism teacher. So the student came with some questions. Now, you know, we are busy and burnt out, like all the time. But we like to have fun. That makes the job worthwhile. And so, you know, he comes and he has these questions about the incinerator that he could have Googled. And so we just went in on him. We're like, why are you asking, you know, come on, like, that's the best you can do. I told him, your questions are boring, just like that. I mean, you know, we were cordial and collegial, but I told your questions are boring. Like, if you're gonna come here, come with the question that's burning. You know, like, do the research first, find out the facts, and then come with the burning question. You know, don't come and ask me how many tons of trash they burn. You can find that out on Wikipedia, right? So that is an example of like extraction versus, you know, like, don't extract from us. You know, when you come correct. Don't assume that because you're coming to a community where people aren't as educated, maybe don't have as much money, you know, maybe we're late, maybe, you know, things look a little disorganized. Don't assume anything because of that. You know, don't assume that then you don't have to show up, you know, fully and ready and prepared. Because if you don't show up ready and prepared, then you actually extract from us. And then it's like tiresome and burdensome, and we're like, why did we agree to do this? You know, and it's happened to us on many occasions. And what's even better, bring resources, right? Pay us, because you get something out of this. Don't think it's just a one-way thing, right? Like, bring resource too.
Other questions, Amanda?
In the beginning, I remember you mentioned that one of the richest people of color could live in a worse situation than one of the, did I say poorest? Sorry. One of the poorest people or richest people of color could be in a worse situation than one of the poorest white people. And I remember there was a discussion about redistricting, just specifically with education, how there wasn't enough representation of people of color in the actual voting of what happens. So I feel like that could be like some part of it. But when you say like racism is what we have to blame for this, like, do you have a more like specific or like a really like a main reason of why this is occurring then?
Okay, so if I was in Newark, I'd have to move my car. All right. So, okay, so first of all, New Jersey is one of the most segregated, racially segregated states in this country, okay? Let's be real. So segregation and economics, just yesterday I was looking at a map that I really tried to screenshot, but I gotta get my tech game up, I can't lie. I couldn't screenshot it, but it was like, it was census tracts, like the third most impoverished census tracts of New Jersey, and then the ones with the third highest of people of color, and they were almost identical. So that's, you know, A. Like, when you're looking at, that's one thing, you know, that like the census is showing. The other thing is that, you know, there's a map that the DEP has that has, it's basically like your proximity to pollution based on race and based on class, and they also mirror, right? Race is the #1 factor in whether or not you live near pollution. I didn't make that up. You could probably go to Dr. Bob Bullard, some of his research, for that. And then class is the secondary one. So you have, some of the poorest people in America in Appalachia are also dealing with horrendous environmental issues, and organizing. Now, I don't go to Appalachia to organize. They got that, right? I stand in solidarity with them. But I stay my lane, right? My lane is New Jersey, mainly Newark. And, in New Jersey, particularly, there is correlation. The DEP has data on this between race and environment, between class and environment, but race is the #1 factor.
Yeah, and also just to echo, we were talking about this, Amanda's in my Place Matters class, we were talking about this in terms of just living in like disadvantaged neighborhoods, that even a person of color who is highly educated and is wealthy statistically is still more likely to live next to a polluting entity. So in that sense, class plays a role, but race numerically plays or statistically plays one of the largest roles in that. So I just want to connect that back to our class. Other questions, comments?
So, hello, Melissa, I'm Liz. So I noticed that in terms of a lot of your work, it's focused a lot on adding more greenery and to the local communities, and doing a lot when it comes to like produce and food. I'm actually doing a paper on that right now for my final. Is basically about the benefits of having well-maintained and having a lot of greenery around in an area along, and then the opposite for disadvantaged communities. And I just want you to talk about, like, have you noticed like any changes, since you've added the greenery in terms of like, just through the years, like any positive or negative changes, or just none at all? I'm just curious.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so the different ways, I didn't mention everything, in that regard. So we do green infrastructure. As a matter of fact, we had some homes that were lost to Superstorm Sandy, where we were able, through a government program, to get those lots, and we're making demo, basically bioswales there, places that can really absorb water, just for demonstration. It's not gonna stop, the next 100-year flood, but as a demonstration of what can happen on open land, because many urban environments do just have plots of land. Trees are awesome also as ways to, as an antidote to all of the impermeable surfaces that we have in urban environments, particularly in Newark. And so, what we would like to see is trees being used more for that, and, not just for sort of like the shade, which is the way they're planted now is just, mainly for the shade. We focus on getting trees around schools. So there was recently a school built, my son's school actually, and it was like all the trees were raised for the school to be built, and they actually built the school and they planted one tree. They actually knocked down like 10 really big, awesome trees, and they planted one small little scraggly tree. So we organized and got 39 more trees planted around that school. Right now, I'm working with another entity to get about 25 trees planted around a school down the block. And what we see, it helps with community self-esteem. People, there's so many studies that show that trees and, greenery just helps people feel better, A. B, it does help with shade, with so much concrete and so little tree cover. There are streets that, are just unwalkable in the summer in that community. And so, it helps with shade. It also, let's see, what else did I want to say about that? Oh, so when you mentioned, Heather, the zoning and the cumulative impact. So when people want to build buildings, industries, whatever, because of the cumulative impacts ordinance, they have to plant a certain number of trees, or they have to donate to the city's tree fund. So we also press industries, to plant new businesses, new apartment complexes, whatever it is. We organize, we go to City Hall, we're there when they're applying for their permits, and we make them build trees, we make them plant trees. So it's also a way to organize community, around something tangible. We don't have easy, quick wins. We've been fighting Covanta incinerator for 20 years. Sometimes some of these fights last generations. The fight to clean up the Passaic, my kids' might see a clean Passaic. So planting trees is like sort of an immediate victory. It's an immediate win. It's something everyone can get involved in. We can get dirty together. My oldest son he was born on Earth Day, so we plant trees every year. And, it's just something that brings community together. More than anything, it's really an organizing tool for us.
So we're just at time. Let's give Ms. Miles a hand clap. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out. Thank you to Melissa Miles. Thank you to our panelists. Thanks again to those who helped sponsor the event. And also thank you to you all.